Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And today we continue our exploration of the base building tendency by going to a letter in Cosmonaut magazine by Teresa Kallisz, I believe, which was written in November of 2022 about the fatal flaws of the base building tendency. Now, this is in response to Renato Flores' own letter exploring why Flores couldn't finish the series about what to turn the base building tendency into now that a tendency had seemed to fail. So let's get into this a little bit more deeply. The fatal flaw of the base building. The legacy of the base building trend will be discussed in some sectors for a while, especially as the current left struggles to regain its footing. Struggling to regain its footing is an understatement. Part of regaining your footing will be admitting how bad you failed, which is going to be hard to get people to do. What most people will do as opposed to doing that is to, I left the left, or more often than not, depoliticize, because I still believing something, but a lot of the way we went about it was fundamentally wrong, is a hard ask for a lot of people to do. Renato Flores has been one of the few individuals coming out of this milieu trying to grapple with the lessons rather than accept that we just failed base building. Regardless of my assessment of his work, I am grateful for Comrade Flores in this. I am especially grateful for his most recent letter to Cosmonaut figuring out what to stand for. It is the first attempt not just to see what went wrong with the Marxist Center, but to express the deep shortcomings of the base building trend. However, it suffers from the same issues that lead to the impasse the trend finds itself in. Okay, well, what are those issues? I know rhetorically, you rhetorically build a letter this way, but I would like the issues to come up pretty quickly. Base building as a trend was positioned as an alternative to the failed and stagnant political practice of the left. Which ones, though? The alternative was based on a strong dichotomy between itself and activism. Okay, so that's the issue here. I don't think it's the only issue, but it's an issue, and it's a real one. Base building was a long process of building relationships and organizations among the unorganized, while activism saw a group of insular activists from a privileged background that repeated the same cycles of protest. Yeah, we're back in a protest cycle. Didn't do anything. Except the protests about Trump have been very mild compared to 2016, even though the stakes are supposedly a lot higher. The latter group was seen as dominant among the pre-2016 left, which led to both the easy co-optation by the Democratic establishment and barely sustaining ineffective at best and actively harmful at worst sext. Well, we're back in that moment. We're back in the sectarian moment. There aren't that many base builders right now who aren't doing it for specifically sectarian ends anyway. Well, all of this while workers stayed demobilized and increasingly less organized. Base building was an escape from the cycle and renewed reformism manifest in the DSA, which, most people in Cosmonaut have some relation to, at least in the editorial board. Not all, though. But here is where the fatal flaw of the trend began to show. While base builder trend managed to get a whole generation of socialists, revolutionary, and reformists to take organizing and reaching out to the working class seriously, it cultivated an approach that was fundamentally disconnected from the working class. This is always asserted that this is disconnected from the working class because the working class is disconnected from the working class. The abstraction is not not a for itself abstraction. It remains an in itself abstraction. So it's really at current just a sociological projection, and attempts to render it a for itself abstraction by just asserting that is a way to bypass the process of building it. This can be seen in the assumption of the working class as disorganized. Well, it is disorganized. It's disorganized in what level? I mean, again, we're talking in such abstractions here that this says a lot and also doesn't say very much at all. Which parts of the working class are organized or disorganized? They vary greatly by sector and greatly by what you mean by organization. This can be seen in the assumption that working class is organized, but also it made us come with preconceived notions of how we were to organize workers and along what lines. That's a better point. Even though workers are largely not organized into formal organizations, they are organized in informal ways amongst their communities, family and friend networks, places of worship, relationships to coworkers, etc. Actually, the notes I'm seeing from the Pew indicate that this is not as true as you'd think. Yes, there are informal organizations and non-political organizations which workers take part in, but fewer and fewer go to church. Fewer and fewer have families. Remember, only 1 in 8 blue-collar people who show up as working class and liberal polls have partners and children. Reverse that. 1 in 8 don't have partners and children at all. Some of them don't even have friends. You take a point from Rodrigo Nunes' book, a book I like, neither vertical or horizontal. To speak of an organized worker is to speak of nothing. Okay, that, yes and no. The moment a worker comes into contact with others, they are immediately organized into a relationship with them. Okay, this is an equivocation of the word organized. Informal organization, emergent from relationships, is not the same as formal organizations, which can make collective decisions. My relation to someone is not the same as me being in a political group. Now, you can base, they're also not cleanly delineated and not cleanly separated, but this is an equivocation. While it might be nitpicky to point this out, as our trend clearly intended to refer back to being organized into formal organizations, it is exactly the lack of concern for the informal organization that caused the problems for base building. I think it would be actually the lack of concern for relationality that causes the problems for base building. All right, because informal organization implies emergent organizations that have their own systems to deal with things, even if they are ad hoc. And it's not always clear that everything counted in the informal organizations here that Kalisz is spelling out actually holds. It cut base builders off from vital sectors of support and growth. I agree with that. Political organizations must reintegrate into pre-existing informal forms of organizing of the working class. Without doing this, you cannot build a political base. I agree, but I think it's wrong to see this as only like you actually need to be better at relationships, not just organizing. You also need to be better at relating and relating non-instrumentally, which I guess is also something Sophia Burns came to too. This comes to another aspect of the flaw. Base builders, in carrying out the organizing of the unorganized, did so with preconceived notions of what they were going to build. We came to the working class communities to do mutual aid projects, distributing food, or having free stores, and to organize tenant unions. But at no point did the base builders, as a trend, ask themselves about what the working class communities we sought to organize demanded and what their conception of their needs were. That's actually important. And this is important for programmatic unity too, which is why I don't believe that you can just impose a program because you know what the road to socialism is. You don't, actually. And because you don't exist in the context of prior socialists. This was certainly far much worse than the case of mutual aid efforts, as tenant unions could be vectors for finding answers to this question, in particular era of struggle. But for the most part, the decision to organize tenants unions was not made based on the investigation into our local conditions. We built them because it was one of the easy starting points for building workers' organizations with few resources, and it was the model set and encouraged by the Philly Socialists, the leading organization of the trend, with Tim Horace and crew. The flaw, combined with our foundational suspension of protests, led to suspicion and lack of action around the 2020 George Floyd uprising, a mass political expression of black youth from largely working class backgrounds against police and national oppression. I would not say it was just a political expression of black youth, because black youth aren't as large as people participated in that. I mean, if you're looking at the West Coast coastal cities, there's really not that many black youth there per capita. I mean, yes, there are definitely black people in the Pacific Northwest, but Portland is the least diverse major metropolitan area in the country, and Seattle is pretty diverse, but is not known for having huge African American communities, particularly African American descendant of slave communities, for a variety of reasons. All right, so to return to Comrade Flores' letter, Comrade Flores centers the issue for base building and the left more broadly around media and motivating the masses. Comrade Flores notes, as we read before, on the contrary, our rivals, which control the media, which rivals control the media? A bunch do, and control many other spheres, can mobilize and organize at a much larger scale than we can. We are really in an unfair terrain, true. They can pour money into media projects to recapture rebellious energy in a right-wing manner, see Peter Thiel, are in democratic, like, I do think people don't put enough stock in the fact that liberal NGOs also recapture rebellious energy from things like the Floyd protest. While we were stuck knocking on doors, they reached millions, while we're lucky to get a few thousands. Yeah, but they don't reach millions with a big ask, and they're not asking to build anything new with them either. I've already made that comment, though. This certainly is correct to some degree. Lacking resources and media control is a massive disadvantage, as it does limit some of the scale of the work we do, but media control and money is not sufficient to do what the right wing has been able to do. Bingo. Finally, someone fucking says it. Other than me. What they do that we haven't been able to do is merge their political goals with the organic demands of certain layers of society. Yep, mostly petite bourgeois, but not all. There are segments of workers who are very sincerely see their interest in Trump. Ask the average logistic worker from Pennsylvania, for example. As more information about January 6th came out, in spite of most attempts at painting Trump supporters as white workers, the actual composition of participants have been sadly petite bourgeois. There were workers in there, but yes, it was petite bourgeois, failed professionals, downwardly mobile workers, etc., etc. With the petite bourgeois probably being the larger segment of it. But again, we shouldn't be surprised about that. The far right was able to motivate disgruntled petty bourgeoisie, not because they just have the media and resources we don't, but because they were able to connect their goals to the frustrations of the petty bourgeoisie had during the lockdown. Yep. The lockdown early in COVID crushed a lot of small businesses. Absolutely it did, and I wish people were more honest about it. The far right latched onto this and radicalized much of this layer. Yep. The QAnon cult was also quite effective at spreading during this period among similar lines, and that certainly had a lot fewer resources and successfully beat out the establishment right in several elections. Yet, despite not being in control of the media at all and having the same kind of media access that leftists do. Bernie and the 2020 protests were also capable of making the impact they did because of their ability to connect to existing frustrations and needs of layers of society they were able to mobilize. Bingo. This is actually a really good point. The base builder trend, with its predominant predetermined formula for how it would go about the working class, was incapable of connecting with the organic demands of the class and cut itself off from the networks that would allow it to reach a larger number of workers. My only issue with this is what I said before. The working class itself is not for itself at the moment. There are too many immediately contradictions between sectors of the working class, just like there are contradictions between sectors of the bourgeoisie, of which professionals in the petite bourgeois are often the leaders of in opposed camps because they have different relations, frankly, to taxation and government sponsorship. Now, you may call it the PMC class, but the thing is that conflates elements of the petite bourgeois, elements of the people like academics who are both salaried workers and petite bourgeois because they have access to selling their own goods and their own means of production, but they also get paid a wage and make profits for effectively private institutions. It was unable to conceive of how to act politically on that scale anyways. This became apparent when the base builder trend utterly failed to respond to the 2020 protests. It's funny to me, though, that now in 2024, everyone wants to bury those 2020 protests as absolutely recuperated because people all played it wrong. We can go back to that later, but part of it is that they entrusted corporate DI stuff to do this or that, while the corporations just saw it as a means to expand their market share temporarily. And as this wind has shifted, so has the DEI very quickly, I might add. The only place where DEI is still strong is like Costco and universities. And universities, it's going to be killed by Republican legislatures more often than not. But at universities also, there's a way in which this plays into democratic notions of valid grant giving and neoliberal grant societies. And NGOs, neoliberal grant societies, that's a term I probably made up. But I have a partner who works for the university, and they are constantly getting grants. And it really does look better if you have people from certain demographics receiving those grants for you, regardless of their income or other social status. And that's a key thing. It can be seen in a timid response to the rent crisis of the same year. Yep. Its response to the ultra-left calls for a nationwide rent strike was dismissive and refused to present an alternative political action to mobilize those rendered unable to pay rent, but rather repeated the insistence on just base building tenant unions. I mean, and the DSA right just insisted on canvassing for Democrats. I mean, I don't really know, how everybody doubled down at the wrong moment. I mean, I also will say protest stuff hasn't generally worked, even when it's morally correct. And when protests do work, like the protests over Palestine, didn't work for what they were designed to do, so they didn't work. But they did point out other fundamental flaws in the university to get people talking about that in the university, which is why I think they were important to follow. The focus on the media, social media outreach, and so on, rather than presenting us with a path out of isolation, repeats the same problems that has locked us into where we were. Thank you. I said the same thing when reading that section. It seeks a solution independent from workers and approaches them as a mass that we just need to find the right point of leverage to move as a whole. I'm adding as a whole, but that's what's implied here. Rather than a social class with its own dynamic motivations that we must understand and merge communist politics with. Agreed, but furthermore, a social class with its own contradictory and internally fraught dynamics. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand why professionals and petit bourgeois compete for working class support in their voter blocks. There is an additional point towards the end of Comrade Flores' piece about left culture. How unpleasant it is, and that unpleasantry is why we get stuck into fights on Twitter and get sucked into reading about past movements. I think the problem with this line of thinking is that drive towards infighting, hyper-intellectualism, and serious organizers find meaning in the drudgery are not socialists chasing meaning, are trying to find enjoyment, but symptoms of the two problems. The first is much more apparent, is that we're in a period of stagnation. Actually, you're in a period of decline. From 2024 perspective, even in 2022, it was beginning to be obvious that the left was not in a period of just stagnation. It was in a period of the drain being opened. In spite of some gains, the momentum that we had only a couple of years ago has trailed off or completely dissipated in most areas. When things began to die down, there is less keeping our focus beyond ourselves, and we naturally turn inwards. Our energy that we have fewer outlets for, and our frustrations can get launched at each other. There is just less holding us together, and many people don't chase around spreadsheet contacts by choice, but by necessity, though some might embrace the task to cope with reality. Yep, that's a good point. For others, this wish for better times or detachment from the struggle during the lulls find refuge in intellectualism. It might be a fine detail to distinguish this from trying to find pleasure in an unpleasant life, but it's a different solution. The solution is largely what Comrade Flores rejects. We do need to go to the masses, and historically going to the masses is fairly successful in its goal. If you define to me masses, what it actually means, While the Narodnik going to the people was a failure, the U.S. left has gone to the masses and has successfully integrated in ways that had long-lasting impacts, that even if they failed to achieve revolution. What are they? Are we talking about civil rights movement? Are you talking about judicial reform? What are you talking about? We're going to the suggestion that Todd McGowan and Ryan Ingley gave might work to some degree, but they are much closer to missionary type approaches. They are methods designed to proselytize. Yep. But artificially making yourself appearing charismatic, ridiculing enemies, etc., have as much chance of attracting people as repelling them. People know when they are being pandered to, and the public ridiculing is just easily reinforces what makes us seen as unwelcoming in the first place. Yep. It's not like the left is not above public ridiculing constantly. It's that we do it in particularly unfun ways and at ourselves. If we're even one unified thing, which I don't think we are. I don't think when people talk about left unity, I don't think there's enough understanding of what left is for us to be unified, which is why I talk about political programs. Going to the masses requires that we abandon our present formulas of organization, our conceptions of how we propagandize, and our abstract notions of appeal. Okay, you're running me back over, because I do think we have to be. We're not at we're not at year one. We're not at ground zero, but we're also not far from it. If we're to make a left that is inclusive and not hostile for the masses, I really hate the use of the masses. Say the working class. The masses includes people who aren't part of the working class. And it's actually a thought terminating abstraction. We must start with how the masses derive enjoyment and build and maintain community. Agreed, but the masses don't derive enjoyment or building community in a singular unified way. There's no way to make our organizations and movements enjoyable to the masses, as the masses are made up of largely a variety of cultures and nations. Thank you. Okay. So all right, get to the same point as me. There is no unified working class culture. Here. Toast, Prost, and etc. I'm going to have a sip of my drink for that. These are inflatable rats that have meanings to workers with the experience in the labor movement, but may very well be meaningless to others. Definitely are meaningless to others. I mean, appealing to what the workers in New York the same way you appeal to workers in the Deep South, when there's an entirely different history of union organizing and racial tensions and relations to different kinds of power classes, not all even capitalist. Yeah, you can't appeal to them the same way. Diversity of tactics often means just like we're going to try the ballot box and bombs, but it really should be we're going to learn where the people are in their area of expertise, and we're going to be able to move between different segments of the class and different classes, both stratified within the class and outside of it. Lenin talks about need to do that. That was what Gramsci's hegemony stuff was actually about before the liberals got a hold of it after Togliatti got a hold of it as well. I'm always going to mispronounce Italian. Actually, I'm always going to mispronounce pretty much everything. All right, Comrade Flores came close to the realization when he said, solutions like alternative cultures are hinting at something, but I'm not sure we can achieve them with our means. We can't achieve them by our means, and we shouldn't try. No left-wing alternative culture, at least in the U.S., has ever a product of the left's own means, but were products of the collaboration with the left and organic efforts of the masses. Or they were products of the left's collaboration with the bourgeoisie, to be completely fucking frank. Not just the organic efforts of the masses. This is so close, but it's addicted to a Maoist rhetoric. Moving from, it's not that communists never used the masses before Mao, but the focus on the masses as opposed to the class is a specifically Chinese Civil War appeal. All right. It is only once we abandon our preconceived notions about what the masses want and need, what organizational forms are need to address it, and how we can make us and our politics appealing, that we can engage in the work we need to do. Yeah, but there's also a problem here. You can't tail. You can't just say, like, we don't have a vision for the future at all. All right. There needs to be some give and take here. The fatal flaw of the base builder trend does not have to be the fatal flaw of our movement going forward. We need to take a step back from formulations and assumptions of the base builder trend and carry out concerned effort to understand the existing informal organization and networks of working class and oppressed that already exist. Agreed. But I also just think if you were to focus on relationality as much as informal organizations, you would do a lot more. Because informal organizations and formal organizations are not the same thing. And you can't just tail informal organizations because they're emergent. You're not going to know what they do. They respond to complicated stimuli in complex ways that you can't just like map down today and deliver towards. Yep, definitely Maoist. What politically motivates them, what needs are. As Mao argued in the United Front on Cultural Work, we must operate with the two principles in mind. One is the actual needs of the masses rather than what they fancy they need, and the other is the wishes of the masses, who must wake up their own minds instead of making up their minds for them. Okay, now I actually think Mao's work is of mixed quality. And often I definitely feel like when he writes about dialectics, he's often like turning it into something like legalist or Taoist folk wisdom. But that's partly because of his audience and partly because of the way we translate Chinese into English. I'm going to say that, however, this point by Mao, which is really kind of a more straightforward way of stating the subjective and objective conditions thesis by Lenin, is a pretty good point. Now, here's the thing is, though, the masses hides who you're including in that morass of groups. I mean, for Mao, it had to be the peasantry. Most of China was underdeveloped. But it also became the national bourgeoisie. And my friends, if you're interested in radicalizing the national bourgeoisie in the core capital, they don't need you. This requires that we take the merger formula seriously. Yep. Not just try to create the movement we think we should exist that has no basis to exist. I agree. We need to make use of the tools developed by other revolutionaries such as mass line. Mass line is class collaborationist in a problematic way, and you need to admit that. Workers' inquiry, agreed. Social investigation, class analysis, agreed. In doing so, we can begin to answer the questions that the base builder trend was not able to do, are to act politically and not just economically, and conceive of what we are building the base in order to do. Yeah, you're not just primitively accumulating cadres for no reason. Comrade Flores and his honesty about the difficulties in creating a positive vision has opened the door for more critical reflection on our trend and its legacy. I hope my response helps further this. My contestations about, small things like who do you mean by the masses are, can we quit talking about informal organization and relationality as if they're the same thing? These are actually still minor complaints. Both Flores and Kalisz, I'm sorry, I don't know the ethnicity of your name and have no idea how to pronounce it, but Teresa K has set out here is actually, my minor criticisms aside, something to think about. One thing I think we have to do, though, if you go into mass line and workers' inquiry social investigation, is to admit that not only did the New Left fail and a large part of the classical communist movement fail, but that most of the trends on the left failed, not just the base builders. I mean, the electoralists hadn't gotten shit either, really. They try to claim that Biden's Walter Mondale tendency to throw some meat to the coalition was their victory, but honestly, that's just an age thing. Older Democrats were more coalitional in their thinking, even when they were neoliberals. And Biden has both the pre-neoliberal and post-neoliberal line. He was perfectly willing to form coalitions with the Atari Democrats, but he's also done stuff for labor and also fucked labor many times. So it's in the long durée of his political career, which is not actually a long durée, but he had a very long political career. So something to think about, I hope. Protect your peace. I'm a little under the weather these days, but I wanted to get these videos done, and I hope you're having a good day.